Dr. Stephen Nemes does a great job disproving naturalism and realism and materialism. Listen to this.
Anthropocentric ontology is distinguished from what I call realism. So realism says that the world exists in itself, right, independently of human beings. The world has an existence of its own, independently of the existence of human beings, which means that it may or may not be intelligible to human beings, whether at all or entirely. And for that reason also, it may or may not secure the possibility of a meaningful existence for human beings, whether entirely or at all. So anthropocentric ontology is intended as an alternative to realism. Realism says that this world, this greater context in which we find ourselves, has an existence of its own, independently of the existence of human beings. And for that reason, its relation to human beings on the epistemic and ethic planes is a problem, right? It could be that the world is not knowable to us, whether at all or in part. And it could be that the world is not friendly to us in terms of making possible a meaningful existence for us, whether at all, whether entirely or in part.
That's what realism says.
That's what realism says. Anthropocentric ontology says no, the world is the home of the human being. It exists for the sake of the human being. It's the arena in which the human being is to pursue its own perfection. And for that reason also, it's entirely intelligible to the human being in principle. Now, that doesn't mean that it's entirely intelligible to any one person in particular, but basically the idea is that there's nothing out there, there's no truth out there in the world that could not in principle be known by a human being. So that's the basic idea of anthropocentric ontology and how it is distinguished from realism. There's also this question about truth being this relation between a proposition and a state of affairs or whatever, a concrete reality. I think that's not exactly the notion of truth that I would go for, because I think that truth is something that is grasped. It's not this relation that exists ahead of time, because I don't think propositions exist, independently. What do I think a proposition is? I think a proposition is at best a judgment formed about some reality that is proposed to somebody else in conversation. So if I say to you, for example, that that it's sunny outside, that's a proposition, but it's not as if that proposition is like some independent thing out there. It's just something that I've said. It's a way that I've described the world. And you can see the truth of that proposition when you compare what I say to the things that I'm talking about, right? If you look outside and you see if it is or it is not sunny.
Aristotle said, truth is thinking or speaking about what is as it is and about what's not as it's not. So you need two things. You need what is, and you need the thought or saying about what is. And then you compare those two to see if they correlate.
So I don't like this notion of a proposition as like this thing out there that exists independently of anybody talking, independently of anybody thinking, and it has a relation to the world. I don't buy that. So I don't think there is any such thing. I also don't agree that the world exists independently of anybody thinking or anybody talking. It may exist independently of any one of us thinking or talking, but I don't agree that the world exists independently of God. So at the very least, I would say that the world bears a dependency relation to God, which maybe undermines the mind independence, thing that realism is often associated with. Well, what I would say in response is that this objection takes for granted.
I skipped some of the interviewer parts just to get to the meat of the conversation. Basically, someone raised an objection, but hear his response. It'll make sense as you listen.
That the world has a measure of existence independently of our thinking about it or being conscious of it. And then the question would be, okay, what reason do you have for thinking that? What reason can you have for thinking that the world exists independently of our being aware of it? Now, maybe it exists independently of my being aware of it and yours and anyone in particular, but why do you think that the world exists independently of awareness in principle, just in general? We'll talk more about this later, but my argument, and here's where I draw from Bishop George Berkeley, my argument is going to be that that's a thesis that you cannot have any reason to believe and you could not know in principle. So it's this unknowable, unjustifiable principle, or proposition that raises problems in our epistemology, and we would do better without it. Now, how does it raise problems with our epistemology? Because look at what you've said. Reality does not have to be knowable to us. Okay, well then that means that we have to distinguish, at least in principle, what we know and the reality. And then we're left with the question, do we know anything of reality? Distinguish, at least in principle, what we know and the reality. And then we're left with the question, do we know anything of reality, or do we only have access to, representations of our consciousness or whatever? If you go down that road, you will run into trouble. If you distinguish what we know from the reality, then you will eventually ask the question, well, how do you know that you know any reality at all? But if you ask that further question, you say, why do you think that? Then we can also ask, why I think that there is a reality beyond what we know. So you're stuck back in my position if you go this route. If you distinguish between reality and what we know, then eventually you ask the question, how do we know that we have access to reality at all? How do we know that there is a reality at all beyond what we know? And so we're back in my position where reality is what we know. So it seems to me that, like, by contesting this position, by contesting this identification between reality and intelligibility or knowability, you just lead back to it eventually.
That's why it seems to me like anthropocentric ontology is the truth, regardless of if you believe it or not. If you think realism is true, you're just wrong. And once you take it to its logical conclusion, you're stuck in the anthropocentric ontology. But a lot of people don't get that far because they just think they must believe realism.
On that.
I think that anthropocentric ontology is a version of idealism.
Mhm.
Now, I don't want to commit myself. I mean, there are different varieties of idealism, and there are different ways of understanding the claims of idealism. So naturalism, as far as I take it in its sort of ontological,
I cut out the part where he described how he doesn't like calling it idealism because it has a lot of bad connotations and presuppositions to it. But just watch the whole thing if you want to hear its full explanation. It's on intellectual conservatism. It's called Anthropocentric Ontology - Stephen Nemes.
version basically begins.
Now he's talking about why naturalism specifically is wrong.
It's what I call a philosophy of objectivity. Okay, so in all of our experiences, we have sort of two poles. There's the object pole and the subject pole. I see you, for example, you're an object to me. You're out there in the world. And through experience, I become conscious of you. So I am a subject that can become conscious of you as an object. Now, every philosophy, to some extent, not quite every philosophy, but most philosophies privilege one or the other, poles of experience. Either the object pole is most fundamental, or else the subject pole is most fundamental. Either the fundamental reality is an object or a subject. And naturalism is a philosophy of objectivity. Naturalism says that the most fundamental realities are objects. They're objective beings out there in the world, right? And the relation to a subject in consciousness only arises later. So if you read Graham Oppy, for example, he will say that part of the teaching of naturalism is that consciousness, or minded entities, as he calls them, only arose relatively recently in the history of the universe, right? There was not consciousness at the beginning.
This is the same thing materialists say, and pretty much most scientists and most of the world, and it's just it's just crazy.
There was just objects in space and time, interacting in their own ways. So
I shouldn't say crazy because I used to believe it too, but just listen to his argument. It's so sound and undeniable. You can't justifiably believe otherwise.
Naturalism is a philosophy of objectivity that says that the object pole of experience has existence in itself. And the relation to a subject, in consciousness only arises later as a result of the contingent and accidental, configurations of objects. So if, the atoms in the universe had not moved in the way that they did, maybe no consciousness ever would have emerged, right? That's what I mean when I say that the relation to a subject arises only as a result of the contingent, combination of or configuration of objects. So naturalism is at base a philosophy of objectivity. It's a kind of a realist philosophy of objectivity in some versions, because it says that the world exists independently of consciousness, right? Consciousness arose only much later as a result of the accidental configuration of parts of this world. Well, my argument against naturalism would be that it has this. Basically, it's an argument against objectivity, philosophies of objectivity altogether. There is no basis for thinking that the object can exist apart from its relation to any subject whatsoever. This is Berkeley's master argument, right? What we have in experience
George Berkeley is a famous idealist philosopher who brought out this master argument. So wonderful.
is an object. It's something that shows itself to consciousness. But then the question arises, okay, is this something more than just a showing or an appearing? The naturalist and the philosopher of objectivity in general takes it for granted that first the thing exists on its own and then it shows itself, right? Because otherwise, if it didn't exist on its own, how could I see it? But this is where I'm going to argue. Okay, you say that first it exists on its own and then it shows itself to you in experience. I grant that you can say that it shows itself to you in experience because obviously you're experiencing it. But how do you know that it exists on its own? How can you possibly know that? I'm going to argue that you cannot, in principle, know that. And here's my argument. Basically, knowledge in the phenomenological tradition that I, am a part of, or at least I try to be a part of, knowledge is, we could say knowledge is seeing that. So for example, if I am to know that you have books on your bookshelf, I have to be able to see that you have books on your bookshelf. Knowledge is sort of seeing that. It's having something there in front of you, and this thing appears clearly enough that you can judge it to be a certain way. Now, that doesn't only mean seeing with your eyes, right? I can see that 2 + 2 = 4. Phenomenologically interpreted, how do I know that 2 + 2 = 4? It's because I have these realities, the number 2, addition, the number 4, the notion of equality, and so on. I have these realities present to my mind in sufficient clarity so that I can see that 2 + 2 = 4 is true. So phenomenologically interpreted, knowledge is seeing that, right? Or understanding that something is the case. So if I'm going to know that you have books on your bookshelf, I have to be able to see that you have books on your bookshelf. That's the phenomenological point. Or at the
A better way to describe knowledge, which he puts in his book, is knowledge is the conscious awareness that one is speaking or thinking truthfully about a thing. And truth is saying or thinking about what is as it is or what's not that it's not.
very least, you have to be able to see it and you can tell me about it, right? So either I can see something or somebody else can see it and tells me about it. If you want to know how much I can lift, for example, let's, suppose I tell you that I can lift a certain weight. In order to know that, you must either see me lifting it or else hear from somebody else, right, who saw it. So then let's ask the question, okay, how could we know that objects of consciousness exist independently of any consciousness whatsoever? Objects of consciousness exist independently of their being related to any consciousness whatsoever. How could you know that? Well, following this line of reasoning, you would either have to see an object existing independently of any consciousness whatsoever, or else hear from somebody else about it. But obviously that's impossible because you cannot see something and it's at the same time being independently of any consciousness, because then it's present to your consciousness, right? And neither could you hear from somebody else that, an object exists independently of any consciousness, because that person at least has to be in the position to see it existing without any consciousness, which is contradictory. So this is the basic thrust of the argument.
Also, you can't even conceive of a world without consciousness, because trying to conceive of it, you would conceive of a world that has an external observer of that world that's conscious. So it's inconceivable also. Inconceivable, unknowable, unprovable, unverifiable. And people believe it. And they get mad at you for believing the historical event of Jesus' resurrection. You should just laugh at these people.
Naturalism posits something. It says that the world first exists out there on its own as pure objectivity, and subjectivity, consciousness, only arises later. I am going to say that is a premise, that is a thesis that you do not have any reason to believe, and neither could you in principle know it. This is something that is intrinsically unknowable, okay? So naturalism as a philosophy makes assertions that are unknowable and that it cannot justify in principle. Now, what's the difficulty here is that this way of thinking is actually pretty natural. We just assume that, something is first out there and then it becomes related to us in consciousness. But this is confusion. It's true that everything is out there independently of me, but it doesn't follow that everything is out there independently of any consciousness whatsoever. Okay, so I am confusing the independence of the world relative to me with its independence relative to any consciousness whatsoever. And that is a confusion that, we have to clarify. So my principal argument against naturalism would be that it's a philosophy of objectivity. It's a form of realism. And realism, the basic, presumption of realism being the existence in itself of the object, realism is philosophically unjustifiable. You cannot give a reason in principle. You could not have a reason, neither could you know that what realism says is true, right? So the advantage of an anthropocentric ontology as a version of idealism, if you want to call it that, is that it doesn't go beyond what's given. It doesn't make more claims about things than what we can justify, right? It limits itself to what is actually the data of experience. And so for that reason, it's superior to naturalism. But notice, this is where naturalism gets its force. So I think all the force of naturalism in the apologetic debates and the Christianity debates on the internet arises from the fact that it starts with objects and then it understands subjectivity as something that has to come later, right? Everybody just sort of takes this for granted. If you just take, atoms and you put them in the right arrangement, then you'll get a brain, and then the brain is conscious, okay? So people just assume that subjectivity somehow emerges or arises out of, objects being arranged in the right way. Well, my point is going to be, no, this is entirely backwards. You do not know in the first place that anything can exist independently of subjectivity. And in the second place, you do not get subjectivity just by adding things up together, right? You cannot add things up together. Things are just those things that you're adding together, those molecules, atoms, whatever you want to call them. They're merely appearances. They're just things that appear, right? So already they imply a relation to consciousness. And so, this is sort of like the apologetic significance of anthropocentric ontology. Naturalism is a form of realism. And of course, unfortunately, Christians, for the most part, want to be realists. And so they are giving the naturalist unnecessary, sort of advantage. They're playing on the naturalist's home turf by assuming this philosophy of objectivity, when my suggestion is, in fact, that Christianity is not a philosophy of objectivity at all.
Also, Bernardo Kastrup takes an analytical approach to destroy materialism. He has a book called Materialism is Baloney. I really suggest him also because he comes at it from a completely different approach, more about quantum physics and science experiments. But anyways, Dr. Stephen Nemes is how I learned this from the beginning. So I feel like that makes more sense to me. But Bernardo Kastrup really nailed it home once he came at it from a completely different angle. Anyways, let's get back into it.
It's an anthropocentric ontology, and so therefore switches things around entirely compared to naturalism. I take it that the goal of philosophy is to make things clear. What we are trying to do in philosophy is to clarify things that appear in our experience. And we try to clarify things by engaging in hermeneutics, by interpreting them, right? I say this thing means X, right? And then I see if this ascription of meaning to the thing in question helps me to understand it better. So for example, if I'm reading, we can take the easy example of a text. If I'm reading, Galatians or Romans, and I want to understand what Paul is talking about, I have to assume that when he uses the word pistis or faith, he means something, okay? So I fill in the blanks. I say, okay, let's suppose that faith means blah, blah, blah. Then I see whether this ascription of meaning helps me to make sense of what Paul is saying and makes it intelligible. And if it doesn't, if I find that, understanding faith in this way sort of produces tensions in what Paul is saying, then maybe I should understand faith differently. Maybe I have to give a different meaning to that term and then check and see if that second ascribed meaning helps me to understand better what Paul is saying. Well, I'm going to say that philosophy is just doing that, but with everything, not just with texts, with the world, right? How does it help me, suppose, to understand you? If I say that you are if I suppose a sort of a hylomorphic dualist account, right? Does talking about you as a form matter composite help me to understand better what you are? Right. So first I'll start with the assumption, okay, Swan is a form matter composite. And then I will see if that way of thinking or talking about you actually helps me to make sense of what you are. And if it doesn't, then perhaps I can offer a different view, maybe a reductive materialist view or a substance dualist view or an idealist view or whatever. But basically all of philosophy is about interpreting. Philosophy is about saying what things are and then seeing if talking about them in that way helps us to understand what they are better. So I understand philosophy as a form of interpretation. Now, the most basic aspect to be interpreted is the relation between what I am and what everything else is, right? Everything else that is not me that is related to me somehow in experience and what I am. This is the basic level of interpretation, the world and the self, because everything else takes place within this framework. Everything else is just some more particular instance of a relation between myself and something that is not me. And so the question arises, okay, how to understand this relationship? What can I say about the world and the self so that I can try to bring this, reality or this relation into maximal light so that I can make it clear and intelligible to me in principle?
The reason this is so important is because a scientist might try and think maybe they can't justifiably prove, but they might have a hunch that he might be wrong because they're so deeply entrenched in objective science, and they might think that is actually. Hold on, let me run it back real quick. I forgot my thought.
Takes place within this framework. Everything else is just some more particular instance of a relation between myself and something that is not me.
Yeah, they might think that their philosophy is better if it's objective, but they don't realize once they decide on that, they're going to have to further question their decision to choose that. So no matter what, you have to philosophize your self-world relation.
This is okay. How to understand this relationship? What can I say about the world and the self so that I can try to bring this, reality or this relation into maximal light so that I can make it clear and intelligible to me in principle? For example, I can say, like David Hume, that there is no self. There is just a world, right? There is just this flash of experiences and impressions and so on, and there is no self to whom they all belong. That's one possible interpretation. But I think that it's phenomenologically undermined because I think that we have an immediate awareness of ourselves as selves, right? It's true that the self is never at the object pole of an experience. I never experience myself as an object. I only ever experience myself sort of immediately as myself, as the subject of all my experiences. But that doesn't mean that because I'm not an object, I don't exist, right? So I think that's where David Hume's mistake is made. He assumes that because there is no experience of the self as an object, therefore there's no self. He's just assuming there are only objects.
That's the same thing materialist reductivists do in every sense. That's why it's called reductivism. They take what is and they reduce it. They take parts out. Like David Hume, like he just said, takes our conscious experience and takes the subjectivity out of it and just leaves objectivity. This anthropocentric ontology keeps it all. It's the fulfillment of philosophy, as he says.
Right? David Hume, in his form of empiricism, is another philosopher of objectivity, although it may sound strange to say. So the problem with David Hume is that he assumes that the self doesn't exist because it's not an object. Now, I agree that it's not an object, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist because it's given. I'm experiencing myself now. So David Hume's philosophy is a philosophy. It's an interpretation of this self-world relation. It says the self doesn't exist. There is only the world. But it's problematic. It doesn't actually help us to understand things because it misses something. My own experience of myself goes missing in David Hume's analysis. Naturalism says that the world exists independently of its relation to any self. First, there's a world. It's out there, right? And only later, as a result of evolution, are there selves, are there conscious subjects that arise, as a result of the contingent combination of material bodies. This is an interpretation of the self-world relation. It says that the self arises within the world, right, as a contingent matter of fact. The world existed on its own. The self did not have to arise at all. It could have been that there was no self. Maybe evolution never took a turn in such a way as to lead to the development of consciousness or whatever. So this is an interpretation of the self-whole relation. But the problem is this. Okay, this interpretation makes a claim that cannot be verified. It says that the world exists independently of consciousness, and that's how it interprets the relation between the self and the world. It says that the world exists independently of the self and of any self whatsoever. But that's a claim that you can't verify. It's a claim that remains unknowable, right? The ideal of an interpretation is an interpretation that is self-verifying. I say only what is necessary to make sense of the reality.
He's saying it nicely, but basically it's just a random myth. It's just like saying Zeus just throws lightning bolts. Like there's no way to disprove or verify it. He's just saying it in nice philosophical terms, but it's basically crazy to believe materialism. That's the point.
And everything that I say can be confirmed. That's the ideal of an interpretation. Naturalism goes beyond that. It makes a claim about the independent existence in itself of the world that cannot be verified, even in principle. And so that's why it's bad as an interpretation. It interprets everything in light of a claim that it cannot prove. Anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy because it interprets this self-world relation in such a way that everything that it says can be verified. It says that the world exists for me, and that's why I have it. Now, how do you verify this? Well, I have access to the world, don't I? So it's for me. It's accessible to me. There is nothing more to say beyond it except that it's accessible to me, that I can make use of it for my own goals and purposes, as obviously I can, since we're talking over Zoom, right? The laptop, the Zoom, the microphone, all these things are human appropriations of the materials of the world for our own purposes, right? So anthropocentric ontology basically is the fulfillment of philosophy because it only interprets the world with reference to things that human beings can know and experience. It provides a maximally clarifying, maximally intelligible interpretation of the self-world relation because it basically limits what it says to what human beings already know and can do. It says there is nothing more to the world beyond, what the perspective of human life can afford us or can give us access to. And that's why it does the job. That's why it does the trick. It brings the world into the sphere of human intelligibility rather than, situating the world out there.
That
And
way,
trying to
when
find
you
a place
talk, you
for
make
us within.
sense because you say
So that's
what's
why I think
true.
that anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy, because it provides an interpretation of things which brings maximal light, right? The world is nothing more except what is knowable and what is available to the human perspective. That's all there is to the world. And so once I say that, the world is intelligible in principle because I'm not positing anything beyond what is knowable to us. And for that reason also, I'm providing an interpretation of the world that is maximally clarifying, right? I've limited the world to what is knowable to us. And so for that reason, I provided an interpretation where everything else that I say can be in principle verified on the basis of an experience. So that's what I mean when I say that anthropocentric ontology is the fulfillment of philosophy. It provides an interpretation of the world such that, it does not make claims that cannot be verified or cannot be justified experientially or argumentatively or whatever. That's what I mean when I say that. Right. Anthropocentric ontology does not have an essential connection to human beings. It has, right? The real truth of things is just this quantifiable,
Yeah, that's the gist of it. I mean, you can watch the full video on intellectual conservatism. I'll just play the last bit where he says Christian apologetics should use this argument instead of the presuppositional transcendental argument. And yeah, let me know your thoughts. I mean, it's not much more to say. It's that simple.
apologetics would do itself favors if it began arguing for the necessity of an anthropocentric ontology, rather than saying that unless you presuppose the Bible as the word of God, then you can't make sense of your worldview. I think the stronger argument is actually that an anthropocentric ontology is the only way of avoiding nihilism and skepticism, right? So the presuppositionalists should abandon realism. They should abandon this obsession with presupposing everything in the Bible. They should abandon all that. However, what they can do is offer a kind of a transcendental argument for anthropocentric ontology, right? Unless you say that the world was created and exists for human beings, then there is no escaping nihilism and skepticism. There's no making sense of how it is that we can know the world, and there is no making sense of the possibility of a meaningful human life. So that would be a sort of an anthropocentric,
And then also he was talking about how skepticism and nihilism are self-refuting anyways if it led to that. Because if you claim everything can't be known or nothing can be known, that statement itself is self-refuted by that, because that would mean you can't know that that was true. And then as far as nihilism, if you say everything is meaningless, they would make that statement meaningless, which would mean it has no content to it. It doesn't communicate anything, so it wouldn't say anything. So that's what we got for today. We've disproved naturalism, materialism, and these are the basic atheist positions. So once you show them this, then they're kind of left a lot more open to the truth of Jesus Christ. So God bless and have an amazing day. Like, comment, subscribe, all that. Talk to you next time.